Okay, picture this. It's 1779 and a man named Hans Fuchs is walking a mountain path in the Alps. Whatever he sees next, right there between the rocks, stops his heart. It's not a fall, not a bear, not an avalanche. He just looks at something. And he drops to his knees and he tries to say what it is and he can't quite get there. His companion is right next to him watching it happen, trying to understand. Hans manages a few words, something about a creature, something between the rocks, and then he's gone. His companion went home and drew what he thought Hans had described. That drawing does still exist, and it looks like something that has no business being alive in the Alps. A snake's body, legs where legs just shouldn't be, a face that's wrong in a way that's hard to explain. That's where we're starting tonight, with a dead man's last words and a creature that people up in those mountains are still seeing today. Right, so the Alps. And I don't mean the postcard Alps, the ski resorts and the fondue and the cable cars up to a view. I mean the actual Alps, the old ones, the deep valleys that don't get sunlight for most of the year. The cave systems nobody has fully mapped, the places where, even now, communities in Switzerland and Austria have specific areas they just don't go. Not because of signs or fences, because of what people have seen there. For centuries, actual centuries, not decades, there have been consistent reports of a creature living up in those rocks, in the caves, under the boulders at altitude. And the thing that makes this one different is they weren't isolated reports. They were coming from different valleys, different decades, different countries. People who didn't speak the same language were describing the same animal. It goes by different names depending on where you are. Tatzelwurm in the German-speaking Alps, Stollenwurm in parts of Switzerland. Stollen means tunnel or shaft, which tells you something about where it lives. Springworm in some Austrian accounts. Springworm because people reported it could jump. Farther south and west in the French and Italian Alps, the same creature is called the Arasis. Same animal, different words, and the physical description lines up almost every time. A body like a thick snake, 2 to 7 feet long depending on the account. A head that's wide and flat, some witnesses said almost cat-like. 2 front legs with claws, no hind legs. It burrows, it hunts, it's fast. And if you corner one, if it feels trapped, the accounts say you're in real trouble. Some reports say the bite is venomous, some say the breath alone is toxic. The specific mechanism varies, but the outcome doesn't. Getting too close to one is a decision you don't walk away from easily. The last part, we'll come back to it. The earliest written records go back to the 1600s, but the oral tradition is older. Swiss and Austrian mountain communities didn't treat the Tatzelwurm like a ghost story. They treated it like a bear, a real present hazard you planned around. There are accounts of specific valleys, specific rock formations, specific stretches of trail where the community knowledge said, be careful here, not haunted, just dangerous. And the advice that came with that knowledge was specific in a way that matters. Don't reach into rock piles without looking. Don't corner anything near a cave entrance. If you see one and it sees you, don't run. Back away slowly, keeping your eyes on it. You don't develop that kind of detailed behavioral protocol for something that doesn't exist. General fear, sure, that happens with legends. Specific operating procedures? Those come from experience. Someone at some point learned that advice the hard way. The livestock accounts show up across multiple regions too. Small animals, chickens, rabbits, young lambs, found dead in ways that didn't match any known predator. No wolf tracks, no bear sign, carcasses wedged and dragged into gaps in rock walls, like something had taken them underground. That's consistent with a burrowing ambush predator, something fast enough to strike before prey reacts, and small enough to disappear into crevices that most other predators can't follow. By the mid-1800s, Swiss naturalists had started comparing accounts across valleys and decades. What they found was that the core description wasn't drifting the way folklore usually does. The details that tend to inflate or transform over time, the body shape, the front limbs, the aggression, were holding stable. An Australian zoologist documented multiple accounts from the Salzkammergut region and concluded what he was looking at pointed to a real unknown reptile, not a monster, a reptile that simply hadn't been formally identified yet. He couldn't place it against anything in the European fauna of his time. In 1921, according to the records, a road construction crew working near the Australian town of Rorris hit something during excavation. One of the workers allegedly killed it with a shovel, described it as about 3 feet long, thick-bodied, with what he called a dog's head. Flat and wide, no hind legs. The foreman wrote it up. No specimen was preserved, but the description from a man who had no reason to know what the Tatzelwurm was supposed to look like matched. And then, 1934, the photograph. A Swiss photographer named Balkin was working near the border when he claimed to photograph one. The image made it into a Swiss magazine, then spread. It showed a pale, blunt-headed creature lying near a stone wall. Elongated, thick. The head was wider than it should have been, almost mammalian. Scientists looked at it. Cryptozoologists looked at it. For a moment it felt like, okay, here's the evidence. Then someone pointed out it looked a lot like a European catfish, Silurus glanus, shot at an angle that made it look like it was on dry ground. Almost certainly a hoax, or an honest misidentification. Nobody's ever been able to prove it conclusively either way. But here's what happened after the photograph was debunked. Nothing. The sightings didn't stop. Nobody stopped reporting the Tatzelwurm because one photograph turned out to be a catfish, because the sightings were never about the photograph. Throughout the 20th century, accounts continued. A 1954 report near the Australian border, multiple sightings from the Italian Alpine side through the 1960s. A group of hikers in the 1970s who described something crossing the path in front of them, fast, low, 2 front legs clearly visible, gone into the rocks before anyone could react. Each time, same creature. Here's the question I always land at with something like this. Not is it real, but what would it have to be? Because real animals have evolutionary histories. They live somewhere specific. They eat something. They fit into an ecosystem. So let's think through what the Tatzelwurm might actually be. The most conservative answer is the slow worm, Anguis fragilis, a legless lizard native to Europe, including the Alps. Looks like a snake, burrows, reaches maybe half a meter, could, in poor light or at distance, startle someone enough to create a confused report. But slow worms are small, docile, and they genuinely don't have visible front limbs. If someone saw a slow worm and described a Tatzelwurm, they were seeing something very different from what they said they saw. Fire salamanders are more interesting. Jet black with yellow markings, genuinely toxic, lives in the Alps, mostly nocturnal. At a distance in dim light, you could get a distorted impression, and the toxicity accounts would fit. The species secretes a poison through its skin that can cause serious symptoms in humans who handle them carelessly. Some of the venomous breath lore might be folk memory of bad encounters with fire salamanders that people didn't understand scientifically. But fire salamanders are well documented. They're not cat-faced, they don't leap, they don't get 7 feet long, and if that's all this was, someone would have made the connection explicitly centuries ago. Then there's Amphisbaenians, worm lizards. This is the one I keep coming back to. Amphisbaenians are a group of reptiles most people have never heard of, and they're genuinely strange. Most species are limbless, and they look like earthworms scaled up uncomfortably. But some, they have 2 small front legs. They're burrowers. They spend most of their lives underground. Some species have heads that look surprisingly mammalian, flat and wide, which is an adaptation for tunneling through soil and rock. Their bite is strong for their size, and some have mildly toxic secretions. Known Amphisbaenia species live in the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, and South America, not in the Alps. But the Alps are old and the geology is complex, and the cave systems under those mountains go places no survey has ever reached. The cold-adapted, high-altitude Amphisbaenian that lives primarily underground and only surfaces to hunt, That would explain almost every consistent element of the Tatzelwurm description. The front limbs, the burrowing, the aggression when cornered, the wide, flat head, even the toxicity. It would be an extraordinary find, but no known species here isn't the same as no species here. We find new reptiles and amphibians in Europe more often than people expect. Not just in tropical jungles, but in mountain regions that seemed like they should be fully mapped already. And that brings us back to the mountain path 1779. Hans Fuchs wasn't a superstitious man as far as anyone knew. He was a farmer, practical. He knew those mountains. He walked that path. He was the kind of person who didn't rattle easily. And something he saw there stopped his heart. His companion was right there with him, watched it happen, tried to get Hans to describe what he'd seen. Hans got out a few words, something about a creature between the rocks, right there on the path. It hadn't attacked him, it had just been there, looking at him. The companion went home and drew what he thought Hans had described. The sketch shows a wide, flat-headed creature on a thick, coiled body, 2 short legs at the front, no hind legs, eyes that, even in a rough drawing made from a dying man's half-finished sentences, managed to look like they were doing something, like they were registering you. Naturalists who saw the sketch said the same thing. It doesn't match anything in the European fauna, but it's too specific to be an invention. It lines up too closely with everything else. The most likely explanation for what killed Hans is sudden cardiac arrest triggered by extreme shock, which just means whatever he saw was real enough and wrong enough. It was close enough that his body couldn't cope with the information fast enough. And you saw this moment at the start. You saw the man on his knees on the path, trying to get the words out. Now you know what he was trying to say. Think about that. Look, I'm not going to tell you the Tatzelwurm is definitely out there. I can't. Nobody can. But I'll tell you what I actually think. Dismissing it is the lazy answer. The Alps are old and deep, and a lot of what's in them we haven't found yet. These aren't folktales from one valley that got stretched over time. These are consistent, independent accounts from across a 1,200-kilometer mountain range over hundreds of years from people who had no way to compare notes. And the core description doesn't drift. That's unusual. Legends drift. Experience tends to hold. Maybe it's already sitting in a museum collection somewhere, mislabeled. Maybe it's in a crack in the rock under a trail that somebody walks every single day without knowing. Maybe it really is an amphisbaenian that nobody ever managed to catch and preserve. Maybe it's something else we don't have a name for yet. Or maybe it found its niche in the deep places under those mountains a long time ago, and it learned that the best strategy is to stay hidden. I don't know. But I know Hans Fuchs died on a mountain path in 1779 because he looked at something real. And I know that communities in those valleys still pass down the advice, don't reach into rock piles without looking first. That's enough for me. If you enjoyed this one, hit like and subscribe and drop a comment down below, because we've got more stories like this one coming, strange, specific, and more real than they should be. I'll see you in the next one.